I want to take this House back to the Prime Minister and his Cabinet's approval of the Kinder Morgan expansion project in November of 2016. This was in complete contradiction to promises made by this government around its relationship with Indigenous people and First Nations governments. The approval would violate the Liberals' campaign vow to conduct relations on a nation-to-nation basis. Now, in the Kinder Morgan approval process, or the backdrop to it, was one of the promises of this government, which was, we recognize the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the land and will respect legal traditions and perspectives on environmental stewardship. I agree, and I wish that that's a promise that had been kept. In the Kinder Morgan approval process, the government can't say that they're fulfilling that promise when in September of last year, a coalition of Indigenous leaders from across the entire continent, including Chief Stuart Phillip of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, a very strong leader in my province, said there is unprecedented unity against the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain pipeline expansion. In my own riding of Nanaimo Ladysmith, the Snuneymuxw First Nation feels betrayed. Former Chief Quolt Sultan, also known as Doug White III, said, quote, "This project puts at risk our way of life," end quote. He also said the decision was, quote, "premised on a denial of Aboriginal people's rights and voice." And many Indigenous governments in British Columbia are challenging this decision in court. 3 First Nations in January announced legal actions against the federal government challenging the approval of the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline. They said, quote, "We do not consent to the Kinder Morgan pipeline project in our territory. We're asking the court to overturn the federal cabinet's decision to approve this project." That's Tsleil-Waututh Chief Maureen Thomas. We've also heard in this House that this government is blocking access, again breaking a promise, to Indigenous women's organizations. They wanted very badly Native Women's Association to be involved in the last First Ministers meeting around climate change, asked repeatedly, were denied. Now, against all of this backdrop, part of the decision-making that, as articulated by the federal cabinet, was that this project is so in the national interest that it is justified to break its promise on Indigenous relationship and to cause costs to the BC coast. But just last week, from Simon Fraser University, a new report came out. The author's Tom Gunton. He says, given recent forecasts for oil demand and what he predicts as a massive overcapacity to move oil in Canada because of both federal on the U.S. and Canadian side, new pipeline approvals coming, that he says, quote, "there are clearly viable options to Trans Mountain that would have significantly lower risks." So my question to the government, again, is how can you say this is in the national interest given the growing evidence that it is not? And when will this government wake up and admit that the approval of the Kinder Morgan pipeline is a violation of its promise to Indigenous peoples in Canada?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank the member from Nanaimo Ladysmith for bringing the issue of Indigenous rights and participation in resource development back before us. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has said many times that no relationship is more important than the one with Indigenous peoples. In fact, he wrote it into the mandate letter of every cabinet minister, and he added, "It is time for a renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership." My colleagues and I have taken this responsibility very seriously. It informs our policies and guides our actions. And that's why you have seen our government invest an unprecedented $8.4 billion to improve the socioeconomic conditions of Indigenous peoples and their communities, endorse the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, act on the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, establish a public inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, appoint a working group of ministers responsible for the review of all laws, policies, and operational practices related to Indigenous peoples, and meaningfully engage with Indigenous peoples on sustainable resource development. It's that last point, Madam Speaker, I want to talk about this evening. Within months of taking office, our government implemented an interim principles for reviewing major resource projects already in the queue. Its guiding principles ensure that Indigenous peoples are meaningfully consulted and engaged in the process, their rights and interests accommodated, and their traditional Indigenous knowledge fully considered in the decision-making process. That's what we've done, Madam Speaker. Our pipeline announcements last November confirm that. So does the reaction from so many Indigenous leaders who praised our government's decisions, including our decision to reject the Northern Gateway Pipeline through the Great Bear Rainforest and impose a moratorium on tanker traffic along British Columbia's northern coast. We are proud of our balanced approach. Yes, there are Indigenous communities opposed to the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline project, but there are others that support it, including those Indigenous communities that have signed benefit agreements worth more than $300 million. Our government is providing more than $64 million for an Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committee to oversee the pipeline's operations, the first time Indigenous peoples will have a direct and ongoing role in these projects. We are also establishing an economic partnership to create more training and job opportunities for Indigenous groups. Madam Speaker, unanimity and consensus are two different things. It's simply not realistic to expect unanimity in these decisions, but we can, however, build consensus through consultation and review processes that carry the confidence of Canadians, and by ensuring local communities and Indigenous peoples are true beneficiaries of resource development. Madam Speaker, that's what we're doing. Thank you.
The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Madam Speaker, the answer is so disappointing at every level. The ministerial panel specifically named 6 different questions that the government has to ask before it can go ahead and approve the pipeline. None of them have been answered. One example is how might Cabinet square approval of the pipeline with its commitment to reconciliation with First Nations and to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, with its principles of free, prior, and informed consent. That was a campaign promise of this government. That was raised again by the minister's own panel. Still not answered. Still no clarity, yet still the government gave the thumbs up to the Kinder Morgan pipeline. It's blowing this relationship. For coastal First Nations people, there's no way that the list of good deeds that the minister's representative has listed comes anything close to squaring the environmental and social cost of this pipeline approval. It's very sad for Canada.
Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We understand that Indigenous communities have differing opinions on pipeline projects. The Prime Minister anticipated as much when he announced our decisions. He said, and I quote, "There is no question there will be people on both sides of any decision we make on this issue." I accept that. The fact is, people asked us to serve, to make difficult decisions in the interests of our country. Madam Speaker, that's exactly what we've done. We listened to Canadians, we heard their voices, and we've taken a balanced approach. Based on those meaningful consultations and rooted in solid science, we made decisions in the best interests of our country. Thank you, Madam Speaker.